She always beats me. It is 6 p.m. and I will open the February 7th, 2022 council study session. No, today is not the 7th. Today is the 14th. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact the health and safety of our community. In an effort to be diligent, the city is continuing to conduct all public meetings virtually using the Zoom platform and live stream through YouTube. Access information can be located on our city's website. So today we are doing a study session, and let me see. Our lights go out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It looks like all council members are present. And I call to order this meeting. We'll go right into the first item on our agenda, affordable senior housing code revisions. That would be Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor Hayden. And I want to hand it off to Ann Siegenthaler. She's our senior planner who focuses mostly on long-range planning, and she has been doing a ton of work on this over the last several months with our planning commission. And this is one of the priorities for implementation of the housing action plan that the council adopted in 2021 and also adopted a housing action plan priority list. And so I'll hand it off to Ann.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I believe Mr. Stephens is going to allow me to do that. Do you see the screen there? Senior housing update. Okay,
yes.
I see some nods. Great, thank you. Excuse me, I just need to move some things around on my screen here so that I can see. So as Ryan mentioned, the opportunity for and need for senior housing, particularly affordable senior housing, was identified in the housing action plan that the council adopted last year. And we found that actually a lot of our seniors are lower income, and many of them are actually cost burdened, paying more than they should be for rent. So this is really an important piece of implementing the housing action plan. And the overview that I'll give real quickly for the proposal is, first, we want to expand where senior housing can be built. And we also want to require a planned residential development for all senior housing, which is similar to, it's a special permit process like a conditional use permit, where we can address impacts. And then we would also want to increase building height through the PRD process, because what we found is we need some taller senior housing buildings. Newer buildings are typically minimum of 3 stories. And we're also going to require that 20% of units be affordable. And that was a very important component of this with the Planning Commission, to ensure that where it makes sense, pretty much throughout the city, we would require 20% affordability. Then we're also proposing to increase the allowed density to 15 dwelling units per acre through the PRD. And I'll get into the details of that according to each zone in just a minute. Real quickly, an overview of what we mean by affordable housing. It generally means we're talking about housing, either rentals or home purchases that are affordable to people who have low and moderate income. And generally, good rule of thumb that helps me imagine this is a household should not be spending more than 30% of their income on housing. If they're spending more than that, they're cost burden. If you're spending 50% of your income on housing, you're considered extremely cost burden. And the way that low and moderate income is measured is through a percentage of the Pierce County median income. And I won't go into all the details of this. It's in the housing action plan. But essentially, I think one way to bring this home is that in Sumner, if a person is low income, has a low income household, they can only afford about $400 to $600 a month in rent. And then when you compare that to the average rent in Sumner of $1,300, you can see that there's a significant gap there. That's for low income households. A moderate income household in Sumner could afford approximately in the range of a $600 to $1,000 rent. Again, well below that average rent in Sumner of $1,300. And I think these are 2018, 2019 numbers. So those numbers, the average rent has probably gone up somewhat. So the code that we're proposing tonight is to help address some of those gaps. One of the aspects of this code update is to update the definitions for senior housing. We've created an umbrella term called senior housing, but most of this is really just updating and clarifying our existing definitions to distinguish what's a retirement home versus senior apartments and so on. We're proposing to update some standards across the board in all zones for senior housing. And one would be to reduce the required amount of parking. Parking is, as you can imagine, it takes up a lot of space. Surface parking is very expensive. It's a significant barrier to affordable housing. So we're proposing to reduce the amount of parking required for senior apartments. We're also proposing to reduce the amount of open space required because that as well is a significant part of the cost of providing any type of housing, and in particular affordable senior housing. And we would continue the current design review requirement where our design review commission examines buildings and architecture and modulation and so forth. And the process for achieving most of these changes would be through the planned residential development process. That's an existing process in our code, but we're updating that to wrap in a number of incentives for affordable senior housing. And the PRD would be required for all senior housing or senior apartments rather in residential zones. 20% of the units would be required to be affordable. And through the PRD, the exchange for providing affordable units is that we provide some density and height increases. And that helps incentivize affordable senior housing in the eyes of developers. But through the PRD process, the developer would need to address potential impacts on the surrounding neighborhood. And the important thing about the PRD process is it also requires a public hearing with a hearing examiner and public notice. So that helps a project fit better into the neighborhood typically. As part of the PRD standards, we would set a minimum area for a project. And the idea here is to ensure that developers aren't trying to squeeze a higher density project in amongst little single family homes in a neighborhood. So we've set some minimum area for development. We're clarifying the PRD process and simplifying that so that there's one hearing with the hearing examiner, and it's much more reliable process as proposed than it would be under the current very complex type of process. And then we would also require the developers to record a covenant that would ensure that the units remain either as senior units and affordable units for the life of the project. And then I think it would be helpful to go through each of the zones. So I wanted to show you for the residential zones and the commercial zones, exactly what we're proposing. So for low density residential, the code would allow for senior apartments, but only through the PRD process, because it's a big leap allowing apartments in low density residential. So we want to make sure we have a process that can kind of govern the impacts and give the neighbors the opportunity to understand what's being proposed. And as with the other residential zones, there'd be a requirement for 20% of the units to be affordable. We're proposing to allow a density of 50 dwelling units per acre with a cap of 200 dwelling units, just to keep a project within scale for Sumner. And we're also proposing to allow a 35-foot building height, which is 5 feet higher than allowed now. And that would essentially allow 3-story buildings instead of currently a 2-story building. So here's an example of a 3-story building. It happens to be Stafford Suites, even though it's not an apartment, but it gives you an idea of the scale. Part of what we'd like to do is to help address the potential impact of having taller buildings in low density residential is to have increased setbacks or step backs next to single family residential sites. So taller buildings would have to be set back further. And at backyards and side yards, the setbacks would increase by a particular formula that we would include in the code. I think the main thing to keep in mind here is that the most important setback, staff believes, is the backyard setback, how far a taller building is from someone's backyard. And so under this particular formula that we're proposing for backyards, this would mean a setback of an additional 50 feet or 50 feet from a single family backyard. So that's a pretty significant setback. Just some examples. Actually, I'll go back to this one. These are just visual examples to help you think about distances. So this is a 2-story house next to single family. That's about 15 feet, might be 20 feet. The 50 feet that we're proposing from single family backyards is, I think, well represented here. This is about 55 feet, 3-story apartment buildings next to single family yards behind this fence. And then to help you visualize that further, this is a project in Sumner, and the distance between the edge of this house and the edge of that walkway is about 50 feet. So you can see that a 3-story building would have a pretty substantial setback from existing single family. In multifamily zones, same approach here. We're proposing to require 20% of the units to be affordable. The other thing we'd like to do is allow apartments, senior apartments only, in all multifamily zones throughout the city. And again, this would be just for senior apartments, not other types of apartments. And we're proposing 50 dwelling units per acre, and another density increase, fairly significant, except somewhat comparable to the 40 dwelling units per acre we have in East Sumner. We're also proposing to allow a 50-foot building height limit in all the multifamily zones. And that would allow about a 4 to 5-story building, probably mostly a 4-story building, but it allows for a 5th story if there's a project that needs to be feasible by using that additional height increase. And as with low density residential zones, in multifamily zones, the taller buildings would have to be set back further from single family. And these would have a little bit lesser total setback than the single family zones, but still the The approach is the same to increase the setbacks, so that in this case, a 3-story or 4-story building would be 35 feet from an adjacent single-family yard. This is just an example here. Here's a 2-story building that is the height of an existing single-family home. Let's say, like these homes here are 2 stories. Here's 3 stories. So that would be setback. Here's 4-story setback a little further. And the idea here, just visually, if you can imagine, if this taller building has to be set back from single-family homes, that area in between can have the lower height buildings. Doesn't mean the area is off limits to development. It just means that they couldn't have a 4-story building right over in here. So that's kind of how the setbacks work, and I can help with more questions if you have concerns about that. So commercial zones, there's a current requirement that multifamily projects in commercial zones must have a commercial component. And while that helps protect our commercial zones and reserve them for commercial uses, it is a real impediment for senior housing and especially affordable senior housing. So the proposal here is to eliminate the commercial requirement from our commercial zones, except in one commercial zone in East Sumner, which is our pedestrian-oriented commercial zone. And the other thing we'd like to propose for commercial zones is to waive the requirement for affordable units. And the thinking here is that we'd like to have some areas of the city available to a developer to build senior housing if they want, but also allow the flexibility to let the market and the site and their particular development approach to give them some flexibility and allow them to design projects as they need to. But if they did wish to build affordable senior apartments, they could go through the PRD process, and then they could increase their building height and densities. So there's an incentive there, but it's not a requirement. Also in commercial zones, we'd allow 50 dwelling units per acre, and we would allow 50-foot building heights, again, 4 to 5 stories. This is the main plus, I always get the name wrong, the main plus lofts on East Main Street, used to be called Washington Market. And that's 3-story. This is the proposed, I believe it's Kincaid Avenue mixed use site. It's the old Red Apple site. And that's 4 stories. Now that's going to have commercial on the ground floor, but that's to give you an idea of what a 4-story building could look like. And to give you an idea of the zones and where these areas are that we are proposing to be affected, the yellow is our low density residential zones, mostly along the hillside here. But you can see there's a lot of low density residential downtown, and there are some bigger sites in low density residential. Most of these are school sites, of course. The medium and high density residential zones are shown in brown in these areas. We don't have a lot of really large sites in medium and high density residential. We do have a few over in East Sumner, however, that are not totally developed. And then the commercial zones, neighborhood commercial and general commercial, where we're proposing to allow senior housing are shown in red. And some of the larger undeveloped areas of commercial happen to be over in East Sumner. And I have some examples of density and height to give you a sense and comparison. This is typically what we get right now in our low density residential zones, 2-story apartments. And it really limits Sumner in terms of what we can build for senior housing. The newer buildings, newer senior complexes are pretty much all at least 3 stories. Here's one in Puyallup, a nice 3-story building. And here's another 3-story building up on South Hill in Puyallup. And then as a comparison, here's some 3-story market rate examples. This is the Nemeth Apartments coming in on East Main. They've broken ground there. Again, the main and lofts at 3 stories, market rate. And then another apartment up in Puyallup. This is a less dense apartment, but it gives you a sense of how these can be structured on different types of sites and how they compare to 3-story senior housing projects. And then in the areas where we're proposing 4 to 5 stories, here are some examples of that. This is a 4-story building up in somewhere in Puyallup. Again, 4 stories at the Red Apple site. And then at the far end of the density examples, this is the I will say pending riverfront project over on Friar Avenue next to the old library site. And that's 6 stories, which is allowed in town center, which is 5 residential over 1 commercial. So the next steps, we're hoping that after the discussion tonight, you can give staff some direction, any additional information we need to bring back to you, and just let us know your thinking. We're hoping that we could get to a March decision date, if that works for the city council.
So do we have any questions or thoughts for Ann tonight? Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. I have quite a few kind of clarifying ones. I'll start with the affordability versus low income question. Because in the comparison, there's the 87,000 average for Pierce County. But so the affordable rate for that, based on a 30% would be $21.75 a month rent, wouldn't it? As an affordable.
Is this the slide that you were looking at?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I don't think I followed your.
So the proposal is suggesting affordable rates, which would be in the 3rd bullet range, approximately 30% of the median income.
It actually, it's a little, that's a little bit mixing apples and oranges. So low income, and I'm grabbing this from that housing action plan. So I hope I've collected this accurately. Low income is 50 to 80% of the median income. Now that's aside from the 30% rule of thumb. So the numbers out of the housing action plan is that this is the income range that they would have. And therefore, what the housing action plan concluded is that means they would be able to afford about a $400 to $600 a month.
Okay. So, and that, I think that clarifies it, because I've heard the term used both ways for affordable and low income. It was always explained to me that affordable was 1/3 the median average. Low income was a much greater reduced scale from that, or a subsidized portion. But in this particular definition, it kind of it's a combination of both based on the level.
Yes, based on, and this is a pretty standardized way of defining low income and moderate income. It's coming out of HUD. And it took me a while to wrap my mind around this as well. But this is pretty much what we rely on, is what is defined as low income. And that's based specifically on what Pierce County income is. And then it's a range.
Okay. And bear with me, I have a couple others. On the 50-foot zone, and that would extend into the low density areas, the yellow from the map.
So let's see, I'll go to the map. I'm sorry, I can't now find it. So the 50-foot setback, I believe is, yeah. So,
The 50-foot height.
oh, the 50-foot height. So no, in low density residential, we had a senior housing apartment complex come in, they can only go up to 35 feet.
Okay. This does not change that. That's what I was confused on is, does this open that to 50? Okay.
That's correct. But the setbacks, the building in any of these low density residential zones, the building would be a little taller, and therefore they would have a 50-foot setback from the backyard, 35-foot high, 50-foot setback.
Okay. No, that's great. That helps me a lot. And then the other one, the 20% of it would be required to be considered an affordable category. Is that a standard, or is that, or because I'm wondering, is that enough, or is that, but if you ask for too much, does that impact the project?
Yeah, that's something that staff had to kind of sort through as well, because the short answer is 20% is a very common percentage across different cities. It is also is consistent with what we have in our multifamily tax exemption code right now. So 20% seems to be, that must be kind of the sweet spot. There are some cities that do require a higher percentage, but they tend to be really hot real estate markets, and they've added some other incentives that try to balance out that higher percentage of affordability. So staff's thinking is that 20% is a good approach in the market that we're dealing with in Sumner. We probably couldn't ask for 50%. At some point, they just won't build it.
It becomes a barrier to them trying to build.
Yeah.
And thank you. I've got two short ones left. One is, how would these changes have impacted the almost proposal for the Valley Ave property? Does it change the way, because I know there were concerns from the neighborhood that were brought up that were enough to where the project, from my understanding, just kind of dropped off.
Are you, council member, referring to Valley Ave and East Main?
No, further down Valley, the over toward Calvary.
The Knutson project, Ann.
The Knutson project.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Does this change anything into the way that project was submitted, and to where it may or may not come back again? Or is this, because I know there were resident concerns in the area pretty early on in the process.
Yes, and this is for everyone. This is the Knutson property we're referring to, especially for our new council members. We had a proposal a couple years ago. It was withdrawn, but there was a proposal for a rezone to medium density residential, maybe adding some senior housing. We didn't see any real definitive proposals on that. But this is one of the sites that staff considered in the development of this proposed code. And we actually talked about this site at the Planning Commission. And this actually in many ways would be a good site for affordable senior housing because it's located close to services. It's very accessible. The senior center is right down the street. There's a park. So it has all of those great attributes as far as location. The Planning Commission suggested that we have a cap on the number of units. We understand from the developers or providers we talk to that a good range of units for a feasible project is somewhere between 150 and 200 dwelling units. And we decided that probably for a very, very large site, this is an 18-acre site, we would probably want to have a cap. So build in the incentives, see if there's interest there for this site, but to help minimize potential impacts and neighbors' concerns, keep that capped at 200 units.
Okay, and thank you. And my last question was, if these changes were adopted, does it bring a change to any of the current projects?
No, and that would be now by current, I'm going to assume current means
Well,
we have
proposed.
somebody
Okay.
submitted something. And,
Yeah.
well, it goes back to that concept of vesting. So if somebody's just been into the city and talking with us in pre-applications, it's they're not going to be affected. There's no vesting there. But if somebody's already in and into design review, for example, the Nemeth project in East Sumner is already, they're breaking ground. That's a project going in here. They're breaking ground. They've already been through design review. Permits, their initial permits have been issued. So they're vested so that this would not affect them. But for other sites, for example, we've been in discussions with the windmill, the so-called windmill site and those associated parcels. And development services is also working with the owners of this site. But as far as I know, there is no proposal yet. It's initial discussions, pre-applications, trying to figure out what's allowed and what kind of a layout would work and what their costs might be to develop. And Ryan, if I'm wrong on any of those projects, let me know. But I don't think this is going to affect anything that has been floating around out there.
No, it won't have an effect on those projects. They're not, for one thing, they're not senior housing projects.
Okay. And again, my questions are, I fully encourage trying to draw senior housing in. I know there's a huge need for it. I'm just, that 20% kind of sticks with me a little bit, but I at the same time, I don't want to create a barrier. I'm familiar with the folks over at Kincaid, and I think they've got 72 units in there. They're all single. I think they're all single residence units.
Yes.
I don't know that I mean single person occupants for the units. And it's a unique type of setup, which is really great for the people that are there, but I don't know how much heartache Catholic Community Services and the others go through to be able to set something like that up and run it and do it well.
Yeah, and this is the one you're referring to,
Yes.
Councilmember. This is the Kincaid Court, and yes, that's Catholic Services.
Catholic Community Services.
Yes, and then maybe this one is the Archdiocese. I'm not sure on this one, but they're both operated by churches, and apparently they work, and there's a huge demand.
Oh, absolutely.
For these units, and they do have a little higher density than the market rate apartments. So I think there's 34 units in this one, and so they tend to have a higher density. And I can't remember the number of units here, but those are not tiny little units, but they're very functional and very popular. So if we had a project on a site like this, the way that we've tried to set up these regulations is to allow exactly this type of thing, where a smaller site could get a third story here if they wanted to. And that would be, I think if a third story were added to this, we'd be up about 40 dwelling units per acre. And so we wanted to allow that opportunity for these types of smaller sites to be developed into senior housing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I know that throughout, as the processes or changes might be adopted, that whenever something gets proposed, the public will also have ample feedback to if there's something that's going in an unusual or a surprise type building going in somewhere, that the public in the neighborhood will have an opportunity to provide feedback on it as well.
Yes, and that's the planned residential development permit process that I mentioned earlier. A special permit process. It requires public notice within the radius that we typically do public notice. And there's a public hearing with a hearing examiner. People can weigh in and comment. And then there are also criteria within that process, within the PRD permit process, that talk about addressing impacts to adjacent surrounding properties as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with me there.
Thank you. Do we have anything else for Ann? Councilmember Brown. You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
And would you help me understand? It says low density residential up to 50 dwelling units an acre. And then it says to a total maximum of 200. It seems contradictory.
Yeah, it isn't entirely contradictory. It is, if someone had a really large site, like we were speaking of the Knutson property, or some of the other low density residential sites are 3 acres, 4 acres. So on some very large sites, 50 dwelling units per acre, that's a lot of people in one site. So the thinking is to add this cap. So the developer would simply do the math, and they'd figure out what they get at 50 dwelling units per acre. And let's say that's 500 dwelling units, then they know that they can only do 200. So that's just in the low density residential zone is that cap. And that's because we felt that low density residential zones are the most important place to have some safeguards for neighborhood impacts, like a cap. Does that make more sense?
I'm sorry, it doesn't. So if they had 3 acres, the most they would have is 200 units.
Yes.
All right.
Or
Now I understand.
I have to get you're making me get my calculator out. So the Knutson property, for example, I'm sorry to keep bringing them up. I'm not trying to pick on that owner, but it's a good example of how we were trying to establish some bookends for low density residential. So that's 18 acres. That could be 900 units on that site. That's probably too much of an impact for that neighborhood, given what's around it and how it's accessed. So the developer would just do that math and then say, oh, darn, we can't do 900 units. All we can do is 200. But from what we understand, 150 to 250 units is still makes for a very viable project from what we've heard from providers.
All right, so it's 50 per acre, but 200 maximum for a project.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Good clarification.
Right. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that Anne would like to know what you guys think. If you want her to move forward with this, when you're making your comments, you might want to tell her whether you want to change something or whatever. Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
Thank you. And can you explain to me the difference between a senior housing and a regular apartment?
Yes, senior. So I'm going to go back to our definitions. I'm not sure if this will be helpful. Oops. So there are apartments that have no age restrictions on them. Senior apartments, on the other hand, senior apartments have an age restriction tied to them. And it's not actually reflected in these, it's
Yeah,
not actually reflected in these definitions, but it's built into the code where a person must be 55 years of age or older, but their spouse could be of any age. And that's a really common requirement across the board for senior housing in other cities. And what we're aiming for here is to provide incentives for more of the independent senior apartments, 55 plus, where there's no nursing capacity, no real services. So on the outside, a senior apartment will look just like any other apartment, and you wouldn't know that seniors are living there.
okay, on the low density residential, you're moving it to 50 dwelling units per acre from the 9 to 13. And I'm wondering what made you decide on such a large jump? And then part of that question is Stafford Suites and the apartments next to the senior center, are they in low density residential? The one we're looking at, is that in low density residential? I know you're showing the picture there, but I don't know if it's really in that zoning.
They're, as you know, that's, you caught that. No, those are actually high density residential, Kincaid Court. And the other one, the little Kincaid Court, Sumner Commons, these are high density residential zones. So that's the answer to your second question. The other answer about the density, it's 50 dwelling units per acre sounds like a huge leap, and in many ways it is in the low density residential zone. However, there were several reasons why we thought that would be appropriate. One is if 50 dwelling units per acre works for a feasible senior housing project in medium density residential, shouldn't that be the same in low density residential? We want to make sure we have the code built in a way that makes senior housing a feasible prospect in all of these zones. So that was one reason. 50 dwelling units per acre it's actually quite common if we want to have 3-story senior apartments, because again, this is kind of the old way of building senior apartments. Most of the newer senior apartments are, I'm going to get to these examples again. They're these 3-story types of projects. And once you start getting to the 3-story projects, for these apartments to be feasible, they really need 35 to 40 dwelling units per acre, just at a minimum. And then the thinking was, if we start with, say, 40, 45 dwelling units per acre to make a 3-story apartment feasible, we also want to make sure that we provide as much flexibility in that for any type of senior housing project, in any type of at any type of site, for any type of affordable housing provider. So the idea was to aim for kind of a midpoint of 50 dwelling units per acre for all of these senior housing developments. And that will be enough to meet what we think is the minimum needed to be feasible and provide some flexibility for some of the unknowns that staff can't anticipate. And we also, I'll just add as another bookend to this, it didn't seem appropriate for us to go up higher than 50 dwelling units per acre, even in our commercial zones. And at 4 stories in medium density residential, at 50 dwelling units per acre, that allows us to get to 4 stories there. So in low density residential, we felt that was an appropriate target as a midpoint for density.
So you're
Does that
saying,
help?
yeah, but in low density residential, you could have 4-story senior apartment buildings.
No, 3-story. Right now we allow 2-story and or 30 feet. You could possibly get a 3-story in.
But how do you
low-
get to 50? How do you get to 50 dwellings unless you
Okay,
go up to 4-story?
Well, that's the relationship then between building height and the density. And I think what you're getting at here is the building height is really going to be what governs what happens in terms of the building size and impact and density. While we're trying to set the dwelling unit density high, in most cases, the building height is going to govern. And that's why we had this discussion also with the Planning Commission. And there were some comments from the Planning Commission about how in some ways the density is not that important. It's the building height and how compatible that is with the surrounding area. So that's why we made sure in low density residential, we only allow up to 3 stories, but the density then we could be flexible on and set that at 50 dwelling units per acre across all the zones.
Okay, that's very helpful, Anne. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, because this stuff gets confusing to us that don't work with it all the time. There's a lot of directions. And then the other thing, so when we would have one public, someone would present their plan, there would be one public hearing, then it would go to the hearings examiner, and that's the end of the process, isn't it?
Yes, basically, just to clarify, there would be one public hearing with the hearing examiner. So they'd submit their application. This is much like a conditional use permit. They would submit their application, public notice goes out, it's mailed, it's posted on our website, and the site is also posted. You've seen the big yellow signs or the big multicolored signs describing the proposal with a map. So the site would be posted in that manner. And then at the date of the hearing, residents would have the opportunity to provide comments, and as does the applicant and staff. And then the hearing examiner, which is an independent body, they make the final decision on the project according to the criteria we have in the Planned Residential Development Code section.
But what you're taking out of this in the old was that it could go on to another public hearing and on to council to be part of the decision.
Oh, yes, I see. Yes, it had Planning Commission as a step and City Council as a step. And we don't have other permits like that. And that's a very drawn out, lengthy process of a review. And it's also extremely unpredictable for someone to go through several public hearings and decision bodies and still not have an answer on whether they have a feasible project until they finally get to the council. So in most of our permits, council doesn't make decisions on land use permits, which is what this is. So we're kind of bringing this particular process for any PRD, whether it's senior housing or others, we're bringing this PRD process up to current standards as far as how our reviews typically are conducted.
Okay, and then so during the public hearing, there's never a hearing examiner present, right? He only just gets written testimony after the public hearing as people have made their statements.
Well, let's imagine way back before the pandemic in the old days. And yes, we always had in-person meetings with the hearing examiner in the council chambers. And people would come to the meetings and make comments and ask questions. And they also, through the public notice process, neighbors also have the opportunity before the public hearing to contact the staff that's listed in the notices and have their questions answered. And then they actually can, a resident can speak to the hearing examiner at the time of the hearing, submit a letter, and or make oral testimony at the hearing.
So they do have a way to communicate directly with the hearing examiner?
Yes, yes. And
Okay.
then as with all of our hearing examiner decisions, anybody who testifies, submits written comments becomes a party of record, and they are provided the final hearing examiner decision, where he or she explains their decision based on the criteria. It's similar to it's kind of a quasi judicial type of process.
Okay. Well, I wanted to bring that up because I just think people don't really realize that they can give an opinion to him to help him make his decision. And I hope he does listen to the public, because just following the rules, just black and white, doesn't really give us very good contact with the people that are living around there. There could be other circumstances that the rules just black and white, would ignore. So anyway, so I appreciate your all your work on this. And what you're asking for is everything that you're bringing tonight is all on senior housing.
Yes, it's senior affordable housing
Okay.
primarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to digest this a little. I know Kathy wanted to give an opinion, but I think I probably will have a few more questions for you in a couple days, and then I'll let you know what I'm thinking. But thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. And nice presentation. Good job on all this. I can tell you spent a lot of time on it. Being new to the council this time around, I'm a little bit confused about a lot of things, but I'll get that sorted out over time. First of all, that slide that you have that is lists the affordable housing criteria. I didn't get that in my packet for some reason. So is there a way you can send that to me separate by chance? It's the one with the
Yes.
numbers. And then
Mhm.
also the colors, the little
Map.
map of the city with the colors.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. And then
Yes. We'll
I'm
do that.
curious in the that one right there. In the material that was posted, there was a copy of a letter from an architect company signed by a Mr. Ludwig. What were your reactions to what his comments were? Did you happen to respond to his letter at all?
We did respond to that essentially at the Planning Commission public hearing. I'm going to summarize our customers' comments, of course, but essentially, the architect who happens to represent Calvary, I believe, who is someone interested in potentially providing senior housing. The architect suggested a very high density, suggested that what staff had proposed was much too low to provide a feasible senior housing project. And he suggested something along the lines of 103 dwelling units per acre. I think I'd have to look at the letter again.
Mm-hmm.
And when we looked at projects around the area, I didn't see any senior housing projects that have that density that high. If you recall the slide I showed you of the, bear with me here, the riverfront project here, that's 116 dwelling units per acre. This is 96 dwelling units per acre. This is in the town center where we have really high density, 6-foot height limits. Whereas the other apartments that we found we're more in the range of the 40, 45, 50 dwelling units per acre. I also didn't, and we talked about this with him at the hearing, I also didn't agree with his assumptions. His calculations assumed that senior housing units are going to be very, very small, when in fact they're not always a 600 square foot unit. For many of these senior apartments, they are higher density than market rate, but they have 1-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, studio apartments, and none of these had 103, 105 dwelling units per acre. So, we talked about that, and the Planning Commission agreed that the density proposed by the architect was much too high, at least for Sumner.
Okay, thank you. And I'm probably showing my ignorance here, but I'm curious how this would work. If a developer submits a project and then builds a building, builds a unit, an apartment complex or whatever, does the developer then become the landlord for that, or how does that work?
It can depend on who the developer is and who the property owner is. It might be developed by a regular developer and sold, but
Okay.
more typically what we see, there are affordable housing authorities, different cities, different counties,
Okay.
and they typically are the ones who will come in, and it might be a consortium of different agencies, but it is typically, from what I've seen, an affordable housing provider that comes in, negotiates the property sale, puts the properties together, negotiates the lending package and so on, and applies for the permits for that.
Okay.
And then they run it and ensure that the affordability requirements are met for the life of the project.
Okay. So on a picture on a building like what's on the screen there, would all those units be affordable, or would some be affordable and some not? So you have a combination of residents in there?
Yes. Now, I can't speak for these particular units. This is a Salvation Army project built by them, owned by them. These are probably all affordable, but you wouldn't necessarily, in a typical apartment complex where we're talking about 20% affordable versus 80% market rate, you wouldn't really know. You wouldn't be able to tell from the outside which units are affordable. They're probably mostly produced consistently. For example, a 1-bedroom is going to be pretty consistently looking like a 1-bedroom floor plan, whether it's affordable or market rate in a given project. And it's just that the rents for those will be established separately.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. And then just one last comment / question. You talk in your presentation about one car or one parking spot is going to be the standard with a lot of these. Has anybody considered the possibility of additional parking being made available at a cost for people who are paying market rate for their rent? I'm just thinking that seniors are defined 55 and older, or better, I guess, and some would say. And most of them probably have 2 cars and maybe an RV or something like that. So can you, I don't know if that's even been considered, where the project would be built with the average of 1 parking spot per unit. But is that something that's a possibility for potential buyers or renters?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I was going to pull up the ordinance itself where we had established the parking ratios, and I've been booted out of the network excuse me for just a moment. That certainly would be a possibility. What our parking, and that could in fact be a really good idea too. What our parking requirement would do is it would establish a minimum amount of parking for senior apartments, which then would reduce the cost for the developer. However, for the let's say the 80 out of 100 units that are market rate, they would need to provide the regular parking, which is based on the bedroom size, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and so on. But a developer could certainly provide more parking depending on how they operate, depending on what their particular clientele need. They may wish to provide more parking, may wish to charge a fee for that, or may wish to provide that as an incentive to get people to stay at their apartment complex versus something down the street. So, sorry, that's a bit of a long answer, but I think we establish minimums, and that would not prevent somebody from providing more parking and being able to charge for that if they wished.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Cole.
Hi, I actually have a question. And it's about parking. So I noticed with the set, well, if there's more height to a structure, then the setback there is more of a setback required. So if there's parking between, so a residential unit and that apartment complex, for example, is that parking complex or that parking lot? Yes, just like the one, yes, that one there. Is that considered part of the setback?
Yes, and thank you for asking about that, because I do want to clarify that additional setback, this is more than 50 feet, but let's say this is 50 feet. That doesn't mean a no build area. It means that the taller buildings just have to be back from that. So the taller buildings, these are 2-story single family homes. And this is 2 stories, so that doesn't need to be set back. Parking doesn't need to be set back. They could have their stormwater requirements addressed within that area. But now this is a 3-story apartment, and that has to be set back 50 feet from these single family homes.
Okay, I did get that. Overall, though, I wanted to just weigh in a little bit in that I am really supportive of senior affordable housing in particular, but senior housing in Sumner as well. So I really like the idea, and I totally support it. So I hope it makes progress. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cole. Councilmember Botetto.
Yeah, I think after all these answers and questions, I have more confusion in some ways, but it's all very good. I do like the fact that the larger buildings are set back, that I know, like for the Red Apple, since that doesn't have a single family unit on that property, is it going to be built right up to the sidewalk? Because like the neighbors were complaining about, having the height of the buildings there. So I was just wondering about that. I know it's not part of the senior housing, but, in the future, when there is another development similar to that, can the developer build right up to the sidewalk, or will they be back, set back?
I think I understand your question. Let's see if I could get to the Red Apple. This is the Red Apple project, and it doesn't show that 30-foot setback, but while this is in town center, so you're right, the code we're talking about tonight doesn't apply here, but in concept, the town center code requires a 30-foot, if this is the street sidewalk here, in back of that, there's a 30-foot step back,
Oh, okay.
or a step back for lower buildings, and then past that, moving back from the street, then the taller buildings can go up. There's also, remember, in front of this, at the sidewalk, there's a 60-foot public right-of-way before you even get to the front fence of the home across the street.
Oh,
So-
okay. Oh, so that's
So it's
taken
actually
in.
really huge, really huge setback, and not to diminish the concern
Right.
that the neighbors had, but in the case of the senior housing regulations, the main concern is for the backyards where people sit out. That's a major part of a person's yard. So we wanted to increase the setback there. So the setback would be, I'm just going to go back to this slide. So the setback would be about 50 feet from the backyard. So here's a 3-story
Mhm.
building. This is about 50 feet. This is the fence of these people's backyards, but behind this fence, they have maybe a 20 to 30-foot backyard. So there's a significant distance here that we're proposing. And then also on the side yard, we would have a 15 to 20-foot setback on the sides, which is also pretty significant over what they are now. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes. No, that does.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't take the street into consideration, like when there is, single family houses on another block. And then as far as the, like the parking, is there any thought about how do we get some type of, I know, like, should the senior apartments provide some type of van for their residents to get to the grocery store or the doctor, or is the city ever going, I would hope we can get some type of public transportation, some van, maybe even van service, because not everybody can afford to have a car or, need one, so.
Sure, or they might be able to live in an independent living situation, which is really what we're targeting here, but they may not wish to drive back from their doctor's appointment in the dark.
Right.
They may have some issues. And most of the senior housing developments that I looked at have some kind of, there's either a shuttle that stops by, and I believe that's a scheduled appointment, or they're right on a bus line. Now, hopefully we might have more access to that here in Sumner, but your comment is noted about the need for that.
Yeah. So just keep working on it. But I like, you did a great presentation, and there is an awful lot to take in, but I think it's a good plan.
Thank you. Councilmember Newman.
Mayor, if I could just add one thing before we move on.
Sure.
Twofold. Number one, we do have Beyond the Borders. Just want to remind everybody that's listening tonight, we do have Beyond the Borders that provides transit service up to Bonnie Lake, even over to Puyallup. So you can visit our website for more information on that. And then we will be coming back to council at the end of March for an update on where we're at with regional access, including transit improvements.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Councilmember Newman.
Thank you. I kind of have a simple one. Are we requiring elevators in these multi-level units?
I'm sorry, am I muted? No, we are not, in our code that we're proposing, we're not requiring. This is a zoning code update that mainly addresses density bonuses, height bonuses, setbacks, and potential impacts. Now, I am not familiar enough with building codes and fire codes to know at what point an elevator is required. And I know that there are some 2-story apartment buildings that provide elevators. So at some point, these housing providers do put in elevators. Some of the 3-story apartment buildings that I showed you, those all have, they have elevators. I'm not sure about the older buildings, like this is a little bit older building, but it has an elevator. I believe this one has an elevator just because of the clientele. So I think there will be, if there are requirements for an elevator, it will come out of the regular building code requirements and or what the housing provider knows that they need to provide to address the needs of their senior residents.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Cole.
Yes, I have one more question. It's really, I'd like to see the map of Sumner where it had the different colors, the yellow, the red, and in particular, I'm interested in the area just west of Sumner Station. So that would.
Just west.
So that's all. Yes. So I'm assuming just, yes. And I'm thinking, actually I was approached by a resident who lives on Elizabeth Street, who is concerned that nothing happens over on the west side, on the west side of Sumner. So I was wondering if there was a possibility of any senior housing over there.
Sure. So I thought it would be easier to look at the Google aerial.
Okay.
So here's Sumner Station.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person you were talking to was saying, hey, why is nothing happening over
Correct.
west of Traffic Avenue?
Corrected, right in that area.
Here, yes. Where we have residential zones.
Mm-hmm.
That is all part of the town center plan area. And we have one project that it's not breaking ground yet, but we have one project here that is a high density residential with commercial. It's not affordable housing. It's not senior housing per se, but we do have some interest in apartments here in town center. The difference in this particular code update that we're proposing is we're excluding this town center plan area, which is, I'll back out just a little bit. So the area in yellow is the town center plan area. And that already is set up for actually unlimited density. And in some cases, there's a 4 to 6 story height limit, but unlimited density. So building in incentives like height and density for senior housing don't really work in the town center plan area. They have a lot of incentives built in already.
Okay.
There are, however, Mr. Windish is going to talk a little bit more about the multifamily tax exemption. In addition to the incentives that we build into our zoning code, like building height and density increases, there are also financial incentives like tax incentives. And there is already a tax incentive, multifamily tax exemption program for the town center plan area. But yes, that would be a great place for senior housing. Good location. And Mr. Windish will talk more about the other areas of housing that are close to the transit station as having potential for senior housing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Looks like we got everybody in there. And thank you, Ann. You did a great job on that. And
thank you.
It might take a couple days for them to chew on it for a while, but I'm sure they'll be coming back and letting you know what they think. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to multifamily tax exemption for affordable housing. And that will be Ryan.
Mayor, I'm sorry, Ryan, to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mayor, on that last item, right now it's scheduled for consideration on March 7th.
Okay.
Does council feel like they need to see this again at study session? And if so, are you okay waiting until April? Because that's kind of where we're at right now with agendas.
Unless they're okay to go on March 7th.
Yeah, we're probably gonna just, I'm jumping ahead to my report later on, but we're likely going to have some special study sessions also in March that we might be able to put it on that will run after your regular council meeting. We're just facing a lot of significant time-bound issues that are coming up here in the next 60 days. A lot of things to discuss with you all and to get your input on. So just wanted to, I'm sensing you're not comfortable, so I don't think you're probably ready for March 7th. If I can just get some head nods, and if you're agreeing with that, then I will schedule it accordingly.
I
Okay.
personally feel more comfortable processing it one more time.
Perfect.
I'm in the
Not
same
seeing
boat.
that for everybody.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ryan.
All right, Ryan.
All right.
Kathy, could I
Oh, I'm sorry, Deputy Mayor.
I was just wondering, and I would like a printout of your presentation and have it put in my box downstairs. And that would be all I would need to study a little bit more. So thank you.
Sure, and I know the council missed 2 of the slides that I added in later after your packet was published. So I can go ahead and email the full PowerPoint out to everyone. And then Ms. Hochstetter, I'll make sure you get a paper copy done in your box.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, Ryan, I think it's your turn.
Great. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Am I still here?
You're here
All right.
in the dark.
It was freezing up on me, so I apologize. I was having a little bit of a panic. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present on the multifamily tax exemption program. And I have about 12 slides here to go over this. So I'll get started. The multifamily tax exemption program is something, honestly, that we already have in our code. We allow it in our town center plan area, and this would be an extension of that. And the housing action plan that was adopted in 2021, as I mentioned with the senior housing presentation, included expanding the multifamily tax exemption to areas beyond our town center that would be focused on affordable housing only. And I'll go into kind of the differences and incentives as I get rolling here. And it's intended to be an incentive. So a developer would hopefully look at this as a tax incentive and develop more affordable housing in Sumner. So what is a multifamily tax exemption? Well, it's a tax incentive, as I said, for the purpose of expanding affordable housing in certain target areas within the city. And if a property qualifies for this, the tax exemption would basically set the developer up so that they would not have to pay the ad valorem property taxes on the value of the new housing that gets built. They would still pay property tax on the original assessed value of the land as it was before it was redeveloped or developed, but they would not pay on those improvements. So you can imagine that's a pretty good incentive. And the way the state law lays it out is that there's an 8-year, a 12-year, and even a 20-year. And this 20-year is actually a new addition to the regulations. The 8-year exemption would be for market rate housing, which, as I said, would apply only in our town center. So what I'm talking about are affordable housing incentives, which would be for the 12-year and the 20-year. And the next slide talks about kind of the differences. So at 8-year, there's really no condition. There are no conditions for affordability. And again, that's only in the town center plan area. The 12-year exemption would require that the applicant commit 20% of their multifamily housing units to be affordable for low and moderate income households, which is the exact same standard that we're talking about with senior housing. And the area must also allow for a minimum of 15 dwelling units per acre. And there's some requirements by the developer to provide annual reporting on who's renting these units, what's their income. There's some things that we have to report to the state. And the exemption does not apply for commercial portions of the project. So if you had a mixed use development similar to the Main and Lofts on Main Street, where they have Top Down Brewery as a commercial area, the commercial portions of that development would not be exempt. They would be taxed accordingly. And it only applies in approved in areas designated within the city. And I have a map in my presentation that I'll show you for those areas that are being proposed. The 20-year exemption is a new exemption in the code, and it requires that at least 25% of the units must be available for permanent affordable home ownership. And the interesting thing is the developer would have to sell this to a nonprofit or a local government partner that would actually manage it and ensure that the housing affordable there remains affordable for 99 years. And so that's, again, that's kind of obviously a higher level of number of affordable units. It also requires quite a bit more commitment in terms of who's managing this and for how long. The remaining 75% of the units can be rented or sold at market rate. And there's some additional administration requirements on behalf of the city. There's an ability for local jurisdiction to collect fees for that. This option is only available until December 31st, 2026. Not 100% sure why that's written into the code, but it is. Maybe it's for a certain level of urgency here to try to get some things happening. So this is obviously a higher level than the 8 or 12 year that's been common in state law for the last many years. There are other cities that do multifamily tax exemptions. Puyallup, University Place, Lakewood, and Tacoma are some examples in Pierce County. And then King County has a few cities as well as Vancouver. And then Eastern Washington, Spokane, and Wenatchee also have multifamily tax exemption. So it's a very common incentive for trying to promote affordable housing. And there's an upside to the developer, of course, and there may be considered a downside to the jurisdiction, because there is a certain window of time that the city of Sumner would not be collecting that additional tax revenue on these properties. So I put 3 slides into the presentation, one that shows an 8-year, a 12-year, and a 20-year in terms of multifamily tax exemption, tax revenue loss over that period of time. And what I want to say is a huge thanks to the finance department for helping with these graphs, because these are well beyond my mathematical capabilities. But what you see here is a hypothetical project that had initial land value at about 1.6 million, had an improvement built on top of that worth 8.9 million for a total taxable value of 10.5 million. So you see in the first 8 years, only the land at 1.6 million is taxed. So that's, if you want to say it's a savings on the developer side of $77,405, or you could look at it as a loss of revenue of $77,405. But notice the project continues to appreciate. And when you hit year 9, it comes back to full taxable value in terms of property tax once you get to that year number 9. And same thing with the 12-year. It's the same hypothetical project. More years into the tax exemption, more savings by the developer. And then 20 years, you're out to 200,000 in terms of tax savings. And this is the entire ad valorem property tax. So this isn't just the city's portion. This would be the whole tax on that would include other, include the school district, library, fire district. Those are all be affected by this. And this slide shows the town center in orange. And as I have said a couple of times, the MFTE is already allowed there. We're not proposing any changes to that section of town. And then the green areas would be new, and the code calls them residential target areas. So these are areas that are primarily, see if I can you see my pointer? These are areas that are already zoned multifamily, medium density residential or high density residential. And in some places it's general commercial because it allows for multifamily as well. And then a good portion of the East Sumner neighborhood area, which has a combination of multifamily and mixed commercial and neighborhood commercial zoning. So it's an expanded area for sure. So staff's been looking at this. Staff's recommendation would be to look at an expansion to adopt the 12-year exemption and the 20-year exemption for the city to provide incentives for affordable housing. And we can always revisit the program. Every 5 years, we can take a look at it. Again, we're reporting every year as this happens. A couple things I do want to point out, that when you look at the number of multifamily projects that are in the works right now, especially in East Sumner, there's if the council were to adopt this, and I don't know how comfortable, we'll find out here in a minute, how comfortable the council is going to be on this proposal. But if you were to adopt it in the next few months, we could bring this to the attention of those developers and see if they are interested in this. I mean, obviously they need to, the projects we've been talking about for several months that are in the works are market rate apartments. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, obviously it's a generous incentive. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we have some projects in the works and it would be worth a conversation with those developers to see if they'd be interested in building affordable housing units, bringing this multifamily tax exemption to their attention as an incentive. In terms of next steps, obviously this is a study session for some comments and start to understand the direction and overview, and then we would need to take it through committee or back to another study session before we're ready for any kind of a decision. Optimistically, it would be February, March, kind of get through things in April. And after our last conversation, maybe not even until April would we be able to get back in terms of study sessions. So that's the last slide. Happy to answer questions.
Councilmember Potato.
Yeah, since these are such long-term exemptions, how do you guarantee, that like a developer doesn't sell their property, and are there penalties, I guess, to get some of that money back if they don't hold up their commitment to the process?
Yeah, they will have to enter into an agreement. And then, like I said, we monitor it every year. The state asks for a report. So it's quite heavily monitored in terms of accountability. And if they were to sell it, I mean, they will lose their exemption, or there would be penalties if they were to try to pull out of it.
Okay, yeah, because otherwise, if you said it's up to 99 years, that's a long time. So,
Yes.
I mean, I understand it's just this first section, but just to have them keep their project the way it's intended. So thank you.
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. Ryan, I've got two questions. One, this is a little bit in the same direction as the legislation that's being pushed through right now, isn't it? Very similar.
I'm not familiar with
Oh, okay.
changes to the multifamily tax exemption. But maybe you're referring to some legislation that was recently adopted. The 20-year was adopted last year. So I mean, it was updated.
Yeah, they're trying to rework it now. I'm not sure where it stands, but there's a couple of bills that not only expand it, but would take away the low density residential from city capabilities.
Oh.
And that's in process now. But I'll leave that separate. That's just something to keep an eye on. My other question is just trying to find that balance. Yes, we want to incentivize affordable housing to be brought in, especially in today's market. But at the same time, I don't want to say return on investment, because that's a hard way to describe it. It's at what point does it kind of cut yourself off from what would normally be city revenue that's needed to provide the services for those properties, but also still being able to draw people in for the low income or affordable housing. And that's where I'm struggling. It's, yes, you want to promote it, but at the same time, where's that balance point to where you over promote it and kind of shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak, as to not generating the revenues for services needed for those properties. And that's where I'm still unclear.
Thank you. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. Brian, I had a question on the tax revenue loss slides. The numbers that are written there, is that annually? I'm sure.
No, that's cumulatively for
Really?
those 8 years, 12 years, or.
Okay, well, what's interesting, and I'm glad you pointed out that the city's portion of the property tax is only, I think it's about 7%. I don't have the current number, but if you take 7% of that 117,000, that turns out to be about $8,200 of revenue loss to the city.
Oh,
But there are
yeah.
other, did you have a clarifying comment?
Sorry. Yes, I need to clarify that. The calculations were the city's loss and not the total.
So this equals the 7% loss.
Yes.
Okay, so, well, that, still over a period of time, that's fairly insignificant, I would think, but I'm curious if any thought has been given to, since this is a tax exemption to other agencies in Pierce County, if there's an agreement with those agencies that they won't come after the city of Sumner for that money, or they're just going to experience the revenue loss at the same time we do.
I would need to look into that question a little bit more. The way the state law reads, there would be a public hearing for setting this up. That may be the only opportunity for them to comment. I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to look into that a little closer.
Well, with all the other agencies that are listed that are doing this, it sounds like they're probably all pretty used to it. I really like this, so you get a thumbs up from me. Thank you.
Councilmember Hochstetter, or Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Hayden. I'm not in favor of expanding this to all the different outlying locations that you have it. We have it in the town center where I think it's appropriate. But I'm uncomfortable with actually not collecting the amount, or not the taxes being being able to be collected for the school, the library, the fire. I think when they aren't going to get that portion, it just puts more burden on other people. So I do think we're doing our part by having it in the town center, but I'm not in favor of expanding beyond that. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, there you have it, Ryan.
Thank you very much.
So I guess we will move on to utility billing update. That's something a little different.
Actually, Mayor, we have one more community development item before we move on to utility billing. We have the,
Oh, well, I was trying to forget that one, I guess.
should be a rather quick one.
Okay.
Back to Ryan.
Comprehensive Plan Annual Amendment Cycle. There we go. Sorry, Ryan.
All right,
I'll go
thank
ahead
you.
and take this one,
Okay.
Mayor Hayden, if I'm.
Oh, great. Thank you,
And
Ann.
I just, let's see, I think I'll just go ahead and share my screen. This is just the agenda item bill for this. So amazingly, we are back at this same point again where we're looking at updating our comprehensive plan. It seems like it wasn't that long ago. But in 2020, 2021, we went through our so-called annual comprehensive plan update. And in the zoning code, the council is required to consider updating the comprehensive plan at least every other year. And when we last did this, it was January 2020. So that now that we're in the first quarter of 2022, our code actually mandates that the council consider opening up the comprehensive plan amendment cycle again for 2022. And I do want to note that this is our annual comprehensive plan amendment cycle. We are also going to be working on our upcoming 10-year comprehensive plan amendment cycle. But this is the short version where we put out a notice. The city council opens up the amendment cycle. We put out a public notice inviting applications for zoning code amendments and comprehensive plan amendments. Then those are reviewed for compliance with the review criteria in our code, and they go to the Planning Commission to be considered on the docket for review and consideration through 2022. And we are asking the council to confirm that you agree to allow staff to move forward with this. We don't have much of a choice. It's in our code. We pretty much have to do this, but we wanted to ask the council for confirmation of the go-ahead. That's it for that.
Okay, so do we have confirmation for them to continue on this path? Councilmember, Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
Yes, I give confirmation for that to move forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Newman.
Thanks. I agree. We have to move forward. I have a question about the process though. Like, I really appreciate all of the deep diving that our planning commission does, but I have a question. Do they actually decide which ones move forward, or do they make recommendations about which ones move forward? I'm just unclear about exactly how much authority or power they have, and want to make sure that we aren't shirking our own responsibilities there. Because I thought most of them were recommendations and advisory.
Yes, and it's actually, this is an odd type of a process, but it is spelled out in our code. So the Planning Commission is spelled out in the code as the body that determines whether or not the list of items meet the criteria for review and consideration. Now, review and consideration is just the okay to allow those items to move forward to the public review process. And so that's going to, and then that triggers the regular type of Planning Commission process. and subsequent council process that you're familiar with. So Planning Commission may, in the end, throughout this 2022 process, they may make a recommendation on whether they want to, whether they think a certain rezone should be approved, for example. But all of that ultimately goes to the council for city council to make that final decision.
And for the
So-
list that they approve for moving forward, that's just based on strict criteria, not about particular feelings about appropriateness of a project or when, okay. Whether it meets
Yes, exactly.
qualifications.
It's almost a kind of administrative step. The criteria are things like, was it submitted by the deadline? Was it the same thing that they applied for last year and the council denied? So it's very spelled out in the code, and there's no real substantive evaluation of the merits of the proposal.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Thank you. Councilmember Botetto.
I think it should move forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Cole.
I agree. I think that it should move forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Stewart.
I agree. Move it forward.
There we go. And I saw thumbs up from Councilmember Brown. And Councilmember Reed, I think you got to go. Well, there we are.
Okay. Thank you, council.
Thank you. Now we can move on to utility billing. Mr. Steffens. There he is.
Good evening. Actually, I believe that Cassandra is probably going to start this off tonight.
Oh, Cassandra. She snuck
Good evening,
in.
everyone.
It has numbers.
He's been waiting.
Does have numbers. Councilmember Botetto, you have your hand up.
Councilmember Botetto, did you have a question? No, okay, there we go.
So tonight we wanted to come before you to give City Council an update on where we are with our utility billing. We are ready to start beginning our shutoff processes again. So just to give a little bit of background, under our Sumner Municipal Code, monthly bills not paid within 20 days of their billing date or 30 days for bi-monthly bills are considered delinquent and subject to interruption of service. In addition, those delinquent accounts over $35 are assessed a penalty. Our last shutoff cycle was in February of 2020. At that time, we had 28 customers on our shutoff list, and that process usually takes a day or so for the shutoff and then reconnection when the accounts are paid. And then COVID happened. The governor issued a proclamation in March of 2020. This was Proclamation 20-23. This prohibited most collection activities, including imposition of penalties, as well as service interruptions for non-payment. This proclamation was extended multiple times. The final extension was in July of 2021, and the moratorium against these collection activities expired September 30th of 2021. During that time of the proclamation, when the proclamation was active, the city staff was very active as well. We developed a utility customer support policy. This was a policy that spelled out how we really endeavored to reach out and make sure that customers were staying current on their accounts. We did administer and implement Sumner Cares. This was a funding program funded by CARES money that was administered through an interlocal agreement with the Sumner Family Center, as well as an agreement with Rotary. As part of our utility customer support policy, we extended a grace period and a deferral for our customers. Again, the moratorium expired September 30th. Really what that grace period and deferral is to allow our customers to bring their accounts current, set up a payment plan with the city, or be referred to and apply for additional assistance, whether that was through local social agencies or through federal funding. Payment arrangements, our utility customer support policy codifies what we're offering in payment arrangements. Prior to COVID, our payment arrangements were usually just covered just informally, a couple of months, enough for someone to bring their account current. Under the customer support policy, we've extended that time frame. We know that we have customers who have not made payments on their accounts since the governor's proclamation. And so currently our policy allows those payment arrangements to extend for 12 months, which is significant. And then of course, referring out to other resources. We are scheduled to resume our shutoffs on February 22nd and 23rd. So that is next week after the President's Day holiday. We have been working on messaging like crazy. My thanks to our communications department, that's Carmen and Joe. We have messaged through every venue we can think of, our website, as well as our e-news. Utility billing inserts. Since the moratorium, we have been including inserts in all of our utility bills, providing guidance to our customers for additional support. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are all driving customers to where they can find assistance. And then targeted letters. We've been, even though we haven't been doing service interruptions, we've still been communicating with our customers, including these last 2 months, sending a targeted letter. That's the snippet you see in the top right, that the shutoffs are coming, and encouraging customers to reach out to the city. We can help best before the utility is disconnected. After it's disconnected, we have much more limited options. Despite our messaging, we are still seeing a significant amount of delinquent accounts. We've got about 350. This was information from a week ago when we prepared the council packet. This week, we are going to be hanging over 400 door hangers. And I'll talk about that in a further slide, but we've got about 250 residential. We have multifamily, industrial, commercial, and church. These are all accounts that are subject to disconnection. What we're looking at on the numbers part of that is over $400,000 in delinquent accounts. So this is funding that even with payment arrangements, we'll be looking to our utility accounts, our utility funds to truly absorb until those accounts are brought current. Some of the options that we've offered for assistance, again, Sumner Cares was offered in 2021. This was funded through CARES money that was awarded. This was federal money awarded for COVID impacts to the city of Sumner. We worked with the Sumner Family Center for those families that have children within the school district, as well as Rotary for those families without children. Payment plans we've offered. At the time we prepared this, we had about 20 currently on file. We began some additional reach out today, and we are seeing those numbers increase, which is positive. And then other resources. Pierce County Human Services has housing and utility assistance through ARPA. That website was available through December 23rd. It's currently closed as they work through the backlog of applications, and they have a sign-up listing for portal updates. In order to avoid disconnection, what we are asking of our customers, of course, primary would just be, if at all possible, to bring the account current. That's of course the preferred. To enter into a payment arrangement with the city, please reach out to us. Let us know. Let us work with you. For payment arrangements, we do require property owner approval. This is because RCW state statute requires that the utility bill stays with the property. The property owner is, at the end of the day, responsible for the utility bill. So just for equity and to be fair, we need to be sure that the person who's at the end of the day responsible has an opportunity to approve that payment arrangement. Or in order to forestall disconnection, customers can show us documentation showing that they've requested assistance through Pierce County. We know that Pierce County, the Pierce County program is taking some time to work through. We also know that it's currently closed for new applications again on December 23rd, but we've been working on making these communications with customers for the past 2 years. The information has been out there. And then even though the portal is currently closed as they work through a backlog, they have scheduled pop-up events. to where customers can go and request assistance. February 9th in South Hill, February 11th in Tillicum, the 15th in Graham, and the 17th in Fife. There are multiple events also scheduled after the 17th. I specifically listed the ones that are occurring prior to our shutoff dates. And then February 24th, there is one in Sumner Bonnie Lake. So I would encourage customers to reach out, set up a payment plan with us. Let's have that conversation. And then as that payment plan is in place, reach out for assistance to help with those balances. Some additional messaging that we're doing. This is not something that we do all the time. We will be hanging in February and March only. Staff will be hanging door tags in advance of shutoffs. This has its pros, it has its cons. It is the most targeting message we have available. I mean, it just really is. It can also help identify properties that are already vacant. If we hang a tag and then go back the next week to do the shutoff, the tag is still there. That's a pretty good clue. There are some cons. Customers do not like these. There's an impact to City Hall and shop staff. And again, we're only going to be doing this for February and March. So we want to be sure we're not setting a precedent for customers to expect a door hanger before service is disconnected, because beginning in April and moving on into May, we won't be hanging those door tags. For restoration of service, ideally after those door tags, that will drive the remaining delinquent account customers in to make those arrangements, open up that conversation with us. After disconnection, our options are much more limited. Normally, under our normal process, payment in full is required to restore any service. Recognizing that we have some customers with significant account balances in the thousands. Under our pandemic policy, through March 31st, we will be allowing customers who have been disconnected, if they come into City Hall, enter into a payment arrangement, and pay their 2022 charges, which is the 2 most current bill cycles, we will restore water. That does not preclude future shutoffs if the payment plan defaults or if the current charges fall behind. That will all be spelled out in the payment arrangement. So happy to answer any questions. We've got a busy couple of weeks ahead. We started door tagging today. That will continue through tomorrow and potentially into Wednesday, depending on the shops, depending on shops crew, how much we're able to get done per day. And then shutoffs to resume for the first time in 2 years next Tuesday. So I would encourage any customers who are seeing this to please reach out to us. And I would encourage everyone that as you walk through finance, just be kind to staff, because it's going to be a busy couple of weeks.
Thank you. Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. I just, Cassandra and Jeff, I thank you. We've had some great updates in the Finance Committee on this. You guys have had to walk through the minefields of the regulations and the mandates and everything. It's been a tremendous amount of work. And that number, you said there's 350 now. That's a pretty big drop from where we were just, a week ago or so, it seems like. So it sounds like the efforts are kicking in. Thank you for that, because I know there's money there to help people, but they have to set it up. So hopefully people will get the message.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Potato.
Yeah, when you say on the shut off under the pandemic process, the current charges fall behind, does that mean if my bill for this month is $100, I need to pay $100 and not part of it?
So no. So under the pandemic policy, what we'll be doing is, instead of requiring payment in full of the entire delinquent balance to restore the water, we'll be allowing our customers to come in, to pay the past 2 months, and then for anything else, set up that payment plan. Moving forward, the way the utility customer support policy is set up is, once a customer is on a payment plan, they're responsible for paying off their arrearages, the past due balance, but they also have to stay current on their normal bill. So So you kind of look at it as two different buckets. You've got your normal bill that you're just paying normally, and then you've got your payment plan payment.
Okay, good. Yeah. And I know that there was quite a challenge just to get people to apply for the money when it was available. Is so the utility billing, or budget is taking a hit. Could any of that be recovered through the ARPA money?
I think that's a really good question. It's something that we've been looking at. The interim final rule was very clear that the answer was no.
Okay.
The final rule may have a little bit more flexibility. There's always the question of gifting versus grants versus providing assistance. And then the question of if ARPA money were to be allocated, who would administer and do the vetting and review? So it's a good question. It's something that we've had some internal conversations about, but haven't quite come to a conclusion yet.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. Cassandra, very good presentation. And in my mind, your people have been overly generous and gone above and beyond to help people who are in trouble getting their bills paid. I'm concerned a little bit. I happen to have two warehouses close to me, and both warehouses had two tenants vacate. So can you remind me who gets stuck with the bill if the businesses have gone? Is it the property owner?
Yes, sir.
So, and according to my calculations of what's in the packet, 149,000 and change are owed by commercial accounts. Do you have a feel for how many of those might be tenants who have gone away?
I don't. Looking at commercial accounts is always a little bit difficult. We know that there are some local businesses who have not made payments in the past, since the moratorium. We also know that some of those accounts, come on and off the list because when we send out the bill, it goes to the local location and then it gets routed to a management company and then it gets routed to another management company and then maybe even a fourth LLC before it actually gets processed. And so there's often some timing issues with those. We will have a much better idea after the door tags are hung this week. And I can certainly follow up with that.
Well, I'm just curious because if a company vacates their spot in a warehouse, one in particular, they're our business, and I'm not sure. So the property owner gets stuck with the bill, and we'll let them worry about collecting it.
Yes.
Anyway, good job on this. Now, just one other thing. In my experience, when we had people with health issues, maybe a dialysis patient or other sort of thing, that they could not exist or they would have serious problems if their water was terminated. Do you foresee any of that happening here? And are there special exemptions for that situation?
So there are exemptions. Generally, if we have anything like that, it's flagged in the utility account as a do not disconnect. I don't believe I can certainly go through, but I don't believe we have any that are relevant in this situation.
Yeah, Cassandra, to my knowledge, we used to have, I think, maybe just one or two in town years ago. And that's really, incumbent on the customer to kind of let us know in advance. Usually we ask them to provide some sort of medical documentation that lets us know that why they can't be disconnected. But those situations do exist, but they are fairly rare. And like Cassandra said, we would not turn off water in that instance.
Sure. No, I understand. Thank you so much.
We have a hand raised by Dory Franich. Dory?
Hello, sorry about that. I just wanted to point out today we received a letter, and this was from the company that actually provides dialysis, but it's a good example of what the letters look like. It's basically from a medical, if it's an individual, for example, it would come from the doctor, it would be saying this person is on dialysis and needs water for survival. And so basically that's what we would get. And then we have copies of those items in the utility account saved there so that, and it is flagged to not shut off water.
Thank you, Dory.
Thanks, Dory.
Sure.
Okay. Any more questions for Cassandra? Oh, Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
I'm trying to use that raised hand thing. So, I noticed our utility bills now are mailed to Seattle. Has that made any difference in the turnaround time when people stick them in the mail?
It has, and it actually is faster. We are now using Retail Lockbox, and so that's why we're seeing that. And Retail Lockbox handles the processing, and we get a daily file, as well as essentially the funds are deposited electronically. So we usually see those applied to the accounts faster.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, nice
Thank
job,
you.
Cassandra.
Thanks.
It's almost over, right?
For this month.
Yeah. All right, so we'll move on to the pandemic policy update. Jason.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me just get my screen share going. I promise this won't be very long. Are you seeing my preview screen or my display screen?
The preview screen.
Thanks,
Yep.
Jeff.
Good thing this is not me doing this.
Well, there we go. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick update on our pandemic policy. Just as a reminder, the mayor signed an emergency declaration back in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. And the city code requires that every time that we update the pandemic policy and response procedures, that we come back to council, provide an update, and then council then formally adopts it. We use the emergency rules that are covered in the pandemic policy to quickly implement policy changes that affect our staff as well as possible city services. So what's changed this time around? First off, CDC guidance. I think everybody knows that that has changed multiple times. It's kind of a moving target. Sometimes it changes more than once before we can get the pandemic policy even updated. But it's been fairly consistent for several weeks now, so we wanted to reflect that. The implementation of booster shots as how that affects how employees are treated through the quarantine and isolation periods. We also want to provide you an update today on the COVID activity, the COVID cases that we've seen within our employee base. And then we'll cover a couple other minor pandemic policy updates and reopening. So just as a reminder, CDC defines close contact as anybody who has had close contact or been within 6 feet of an infected person for a cumulative total of 15 minutes or more over a 24-hour period. So that could be multiple short exposures that total 15 minutes in a 24-hour period. And that's whether the employee or the individual is masked or not. And then the CDC has gone on to say that there's 2 different classifications of people, and depending on where you fit in these classifications determines how long you have to quarantine or isolate. So the first is unvaccinated or vaccinated but not boosted. And then the second is boosted within the last 6 months, or vaccinated within the last 6 months, or you've tested positive within the last 90 days. So to clarify, you're either been recently vaccinated, recently boosted, or you've had COVID in the last 90 days, or you're unvaccinated or vaccinated more than 6 months ago. So if you are the recently vaccinated or boosted, or you've recently had COVID, quarantine is not necessary. We're telling people to watch your symptoms for 10 days. If symptoms develop, you must isolate and then take precautions for a full 10 days wearing a mask. If you are unvaccinated or vaccinated longer than 6 months ago or not boosted, the employee must quarantine for at least 5 days. That means staying at home, watch for symptoms for the full 10 days. If symptoms develop, you're to be isolating, take precautions for 10 days, and then get tested 5 days after the close contact occurs. So what this really has created for us is two classes of employees: those that are either recently vaccinated and or boosted or recently had COVID, versus everybody else. And what we saw, especially right after first of the year, was, as Omicron was spreading rapidly, we started seeing impacts to our workforce, because as people were getting exposed either at work or having close contact with somebody outside of work, they were then having to be off of work for 5 days at a minimum. And then, once again, if that happened at work, we're sending employees home that had those close contact. So how's our staff stack up here right now? We're sitting about 72%, looking at staff wide, that are vaccinated. Of those, 40% are boosted, and then 28% are unvaccinated. I'm not going to go through each location here, but you can see that the vaccination rates vary based on, whether they're a city hall employee, a police department employee, treatment plant, or field crew. And then the boosted percentage varies as well. And then it's also broken down by union on this slide. Since the pandemic began, we have seen a number of positive results, many more exposures, but once again, with the latest guideline or guidance from the CDC that started at the first of the year, these reported exposures really started impacting our ability to provide service. We immediately, started restricting employees' ability to work in groups, take breaks together, kind of went back almost to the early days of the pandemic on a lot of our restrictions. Thankfully, we're starting to see that definitely go down, just like the rest of the county. So as I mentioned, we have updated our pandemic policy. Mayor Hayden signed it on February 3rd. We're presenting that to you tonight. Some of the other highlights: we added language encouraging face coverings to provide higher level of protection. So you may recall in the month of December, early January, CDC came out and said, cloth is okay, but really, for added protection, you should be wearing a KN95 or an N95 mask. So the pandemic policy now encourages that higher level of mask. It reiterated that positive cases must be reported to human resources, because we do have to track those positive cases, and we do get contacted by the health department when we have more than more than two positive cases rather, within our employee base. We added some rules regarding vehicle sharing to make sure that we're not, causing that close contact. We removed a whole bunch of language in there that referenced access restriction to City Hall, the phases and teams. As you may recall, we set that up early in the pandemic, and it's no longer necessary. We added an additional floating holiday for those employees that receive the booster. That provides the highest level of protection, and we want to encourage our staff to get boosted, because if they're boosted and they have a close contact, they're not having to go home for 5 days. And then also, as an incentive, those employees that are completely vaccinated and boosted, if they happen to test positive for COVID, they'd be eligible for up to 40 hours of emergency sick leave, if, to help recover from that. Because those employees have done everything we've asked them. They've done everything that they can to protect themselves, and they still get sick. And then lastly, like Cassandra just mentioned, it provides a short-term amendment to our utility disconnection code, and allows customers to enter into that payment plan after being disconnected, provided they pay 2 months of service, and that expires on March 31st. Lastly, I want to just touch base on facility reopening. We are planning on March 7th, a limited return to in-person council meetings. And that first meeting, our intent is really just the mayor and some key staff members in person here, the rest of council operating remotely, just like you are today. We anticipate committee meetings and study sessions will remain virtual through at least March. And then we'll slowly rephase in more council members as we go. But as you recall, our rules already allow for hybrid meeting attendance. So it will be a definitely phased in approach as people are comfortable and community spread remains low. And then April 4th, we have a full re-implementation of the city's telework policy, which requires a minimum of 2 days per week on site for all employees, and updated telework agreements. City Hall service hours are unchanged. We are still open, unlocked doors to the public Monday through Thursday, 8 to 5. And then virtual service only on Fridays from 8 until noon. And then also on that Monday through Thursday, virtual services are available 7:30 to 8 in the morning and 5 until 5:30 at night. So really, City Hall in some capacity is available to the public from 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and then 8 until noon on Fridays. Happy to answer any questions.
Councilmember Botetto.
So I know that you were going to have City Hall open on Fridays for people trying to pay their utility bills. Is that just through March?
That is actually just the next 2 weeks. We will have
Just 2 weeks. Okay.
Fridays open, just to deal with the additional influx of people trying to come in and pay off their utility accounts.
Yeah, Councilmember Potato, we will be open this Friday afternoon from noon to 5, and then like a normal business 8 to 5 on Friday the 25th.
Oh, okay.
So like a day and a half of Fridays.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Cole.
I just wanted to clarify a couple things. So you're encouraged, well, this policy is encouraging masks that provide a higher level of protection, but I want to confirm that masks are mandatory.
Thank you. That's a great point, Councilmember Cole. Masks are definitely mandatory regardless of vaccination status at this point. We are following the Department of Health order through the state. And then we're encouraging you to please wear something higher than just a cloth mask.
Okay. And there is also reference to the 40 hours of leave it says if you're vaccinated, and I don't remember exactly what else it said, but I want to confirm that if you're not vaccinated, that means that you are not eligible for those 40 hours.
Correct. You're not eligible for those emergency sick leave hours, but you can still use your own accrued leave.
Okay. And then one last question. Was time off offered, even if it was just a couple hours for staff members to actually get vaccinated?
Yes, we've definitely allowed staff to, and we continue to allow staff if they want to get vaccinated to do that on work time. Many of our staff are vaccinated at a drive-through clinic that happened here in the city.
Okay, great. All right, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. Is the city planning on following if the state requirement is lifted, which is anticipated in the next week or so, that'll be announced, that the city will revise according to what the state does?
Correct. And, we've written enough flexibility in the pandemic policy that we follow the CDC and Department of Health guidelines. So as they change ever so slightly, particularly around masking, because we do all anticipate that there's going to be some changes in that. announce later this week, we will adopt those just like we have previously as those have changed.
Great. And then my other one's just kind of a comment. I'm not a big fan of the 40-hour emergency bank that's segregated between vaccinated and not vaccinated, especially when there are so many reasons on why somebody wouldn't be vaccinated. So just my comment on that.
And just to clarify that, Mr. Reed, if an employee has a religious or a medical exemption to being vaccinated, we do have a policy that they can come and contact HR, ask for an exemption, and then they are entitled to some of these other leaves and floating holidays.
All right. Any other questions? Seeing none, that was a long meeting. I'm going to call this meeting adjourned at 8:15.
Good night, everyone.
Guys.